Was Robin Hood a real person who walked through Sherwood Forest, or just a story that grew from whispers in medieval taverns? Tonight, we uncover the truth behind history's greatest outlaw. For over 800 years, the name Robin Hood has captured imaginations worldwide. A skilled archer who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. A rebel who fought corrupt sheriffs and protected the innocent. But here is what most people do and know. The Robin Hood we think we know barely existed in the earliest stories. The first written mention of Robin Hood appears in 1377 in a poem called Piers Plowman. But this Robin isn't the noble hero we recognize. He's described as a rough, violent outlaw that common people knew stories about. The author writes about rhymes of Robin Hood, suggesting these tales were already popular among ordinary folk. This early Robin Hood was no gentleman. He was a yeoman, a free peasant, not a displaced nobleman. He lived in Barnesdale Forest in Yorkshire, not Sherwood Forest in Nottinghamshire. And his enemy wasn't the Sheriff of Nottingham, but the Sheriff of York and corrupt church officials. The oldest complete Robin Hood story is a jest of Robin Hood, written around 1450. This ballad gives us our first detailed look at Robin's world. In it, Robin is a devout Christian who respects the Virgin Mary, but hates corrupt clergy. He's brutal to his enemies, but generous to the poor and honest. In one scene, Robin stops 3 travelers and asks how much money they carry. When they lie about having only small amounts, Robin's men search them and find they're wealthy. Robin takes their gold but spares their lives, saying you should have told the truth. When they encounter a poor knight who honestly admits he has almost nothing, Robin gives him money instead. This wasn't random robbery, it was a twisted form of justice. Robin Hood operated by a strict code that made sense to medieval people facing corruption and unfair taxation. If you were honest and poor, Robin helped you. If you were dishonest and wealthy, especially if you abused your power, Robin punished you. But here's where it gets interesting for historians. These early stories contain remarkably specific details about real places, real legal procedures, and real social conditions in medieval Yorkshire. They mention actual towns, real forests, and genuine historical events. This level of detail suggests the stories might be based on real experiences. Some historians believe Robin Hood was based on a real outlaw active in Yorkshire between 1290 and 1350. Court records from this period mention several men named Robin Hood or Robert Hood who were charged with poaching, assault, and robbery. One Robert Hood from Wakefield appears in court documents from 1316. Charged with theft and trespassing in royal forests. The problem is that Robin Hood was such a common name combination that finding the real Robin Hood in historical records is like finding a needle in a haystack. Medieval documents mention dozens of Robin Hoods, making it impossible to know which one, if any, inspired the legends. But what if we're asking the wrong question? What if Robin Hood wasn't one person but a title? A name that multiple outlaws used to strike fear into corrupt officials? What if Robin Hood was actually a revolutionary movement that lasted for decades? How did a simple forest bandit become the most famous outlaw in history? The answer will surprise you and change everything you thought you knew about this legendary figure who has inspired countless stories, movies, and books for over 8 centuries.
What if Robin Hood wasn't one man, but a dangerous idea that spread like wildfire through medieval England, inspiring dozens of outlaws to take up his name? By the late 1300s, something extraordinary was happening across northern England. Court records from Yorkshire, Lancashire, and Derbyshire began reporting multiple men using the name Robin Hood, or variations like Robahad and Hobahad. These weren't coincidences, they were copycats, rebels adopting a famous outlaw's identity to strike fear into local authorities. In 1381, the name Robin Hood appeared in legal documents from 3 different counties on the same day. One Robin Hood was accused of poaching deer in Sherwood Forest. Another was charged with highway robbery nearby. A third was wanted for attacking tax collectors in Lancashire. Either Robin Hood could travel impossibly fast, or multiple men were using his name. This makes perfect sense when you understand medieval outlaw culture. Successful bandits became folk heroes, and their names became brands that other criminals adopted. It was like modern hackers using the same alias. The name carried power and reputation that made victims more likely to surrender without a fight. The Robin Hood story spread through ballads, medieval England's version of viral content. Professional storytellers called minstrels traveled from village to village, singing tales of Robin's adventures. Each minstrel added their own details, making the stories longer and more exciting to attract larger audiences. These ballads were entertainment, but they were also political propaganda. In an age when most people couldn't read, stories were how news and ideas spread. Robin Hood ballads contained coded criticism of corrupt officials, unfair taxes, and abuse of power. Singing about Robin was a safe way to express dangerous political opinions. Somewhere between 1400 and 1500, something crucial changed in the Robin Hood story. The location shifted from Yorkshire's Barnsdale Forest to Nottinghamshire's Sherwood Forest. Robin's enemy changed from various corrupt officials to specifically the Sheriff of Nottingham. This wasn't random. It was deliberate myth-making. Nottinghamshire was more politically important than Yorkshire. By moving Robin there, storytellers made him relevant to national politics instead of just local grievances. The Sheriff of Nottingham was a real position with real power, making Robin's rebellion feel more significant and threatening to authorities. By 1500, Robin Hood had evolved from a local Yorkshire outlaw into England's national folk hero. His stories appeared in printed books for the first time, reaching educated audiences who had previously only heard them sung in taverns. These early books standardized the tales, but they also began sanitizing them. The printed Robin Hood was cleaner, more moral, and less violent than the ballad version. Publishers wanted to sell books to respectable customers, so they emphasized Robin's charity and downplayed his brutality. This began the transformation from dangerous outlaw to noble hero. During the Tudor period, Robin Hood stories served a new political purpose. Henry VIII's government promoted them because they showed resistance to corrupt church officials. Perfect propaganda during Henry's break with the Catholic Church. Robin's hatred of greedy monks and corrupt bishops made him a Protestant hero. But the most dramatic change came during the English Civil War in the 1640s. Parliamentary forces fighting King Charles adopted Robin Hood as their symbol. They argued that, like Robin, they were protecting the people from tyrannical authority. Royalist writers responded by claiming Robin was actually loyal to good kings and only fought corrupt officials. This political tug-of-war over Robin Hood's meaning reveals something fascinating about legend. They're not fixed stories. They're mirrors that reflect the fears, hopes, and values of each generation that tells them. Medieval people saw Robin as a violent outlaw who served rough justice. Tudor audiences saw him as a religious reformer. Civil War partisans saw him as a political revolutionary. But none of these versions prepared the world for what happened next. In the 18th century, a group of romantic writers would completely reinvent Robin Hood, transforming him from a rough yeoman outlaw into a displaced nobleman fighting for justice. This new Robin Hood would conquer the world, but he would also bury the real medieval outlaw forever.
What if the Robin Hood, never existed in medieval times, but was actually invented by romantic writers 300 years later? The transformation began in 1765, when Thomas Percy published his relics of ancient English poetry. Percy was a bishop and scholar who collected old ballads, but he had a problem. The original Robin Hood stories were too rough and violent for his educated readers. So Percy did something that changed history. He rewrote them. Percy's Robin Hood wasn't a yeoman farmer turned outlaw. He was Robert Earl of Huntingdon, a nobleman who lost his lands through political persecution and retreated to the forest to fight injustice. This single change transformed everything. Medieval audiences could accept a violent peasant outlaw because that matched their harsh reality. But 18th century readers wanted heroes who reflected their values of honor, nobility, and refined behavior. Percy gave them exactly that. The idea of Robin as a displaced nobleman spread like wildfire through romantic literature. Writers loved this version because it solved a crucial problem. How do you make an outlaw sympathetic to law-abiding readers? Make him a legitimate authority figure who was wrongfully stripped of his position. Suddenly, Robin wasn't a criminal. He was a rightful lord reclaiming what was stolen from him. In 1819, Sir Walter Scott published Ivanhoe, featuring Robin Hood as a supporting character. Scott's Robin Hood was everything Percy had dreamed of, and even more. He was noble, courteous, brave, and totally dedicated to justice. He spoke with elegance, had perfect manners, and never committed crimes for personal gain. Basically, he was a gentleman outlaw. Scott's novel became a huge hit, translated into tons of languages, and read all over Europe and America. For the first time, Robin Hood turned into a global sensation. But here's the kicker. Scott's version was totally disconnected from the medieval reality. The old Robin Hood ballads never even mentioned the Earl of Huntingdon. That title didn't pop up until 1529, more than 200 years after the first Robin Hood stories came out. The Romantic writers had unwittingly crafted a completely fictional backstory and sold it to the world as if it were historical fact. This noble Robin Hood fit right in with Victorian values about heroism and social responsibility. Victorian writers jumped on the bandwagon, adding new elements that would stick around in the legend for good. They introduced Maid Marian as his love interest, a character borrowed from totally unrelated French pastoral plays. They highlighted his archery skills and the loyalty of his merry men. They even placed him squarely in the time of Richard the Lionheart and his brother John, giving the stories a specific historical context that the medieval ballads never had. The Victorian Robin Hood became a moral role model for kids. Publishers churned out countless books showing Robin as the perfect Christian gentleman, using his skills to protect the innocent and serve God. These stories taught that true nobility came from character, not birth, but they still insisted Robin was noble by birth anyway. This contradiction didn't faze anyone, because the message was way more important than being historically accurate. The most influential Victorian adaptation was Howard Pyle's The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood. Published in 1883, Pyle's stunning illustrations and exciting storytelling captured imaginations all over the world. His Robin Hood was brave, cheerful, and completely moral. He never killed unnecessarily, always protected women and children, and treated his enemies with courtesy. Pyle's book became the go-to Robin Hood for generations. It was translated everywhere and adapted into countless other formats. But Pyle's version had almost nothing in common with the medieval ballads, except for the name and the forest setting. The medieval Robin Hood was brutal to his enemies, showed little interest in protecting the innocent unless they could pay him, and cared more about getting revenge on corrupt officials than about abstract justice. The Romantic transformation was so successful that it wiped the medieval Robin Hood from popular memory. By 1900, most people had no clue that the original Robin Hood stories were totally different from the noble outlaw they adored. Libraries and scholars kept the medieval ballads alive, but popular culture had moved on to something more appealing. This tells us something really important about how legends evolve. They don't preserve historical truth. They adapt to meet the needs of each generation. Medieval folks wanted stories about rough justice in a violent world. Romantic-era readers craved noble heroes who embodied their ideals of honor and refinement. Victorian families sought moral examples for their kids. Each generation got the Robin Hood they needed, not the one that actually existed. The Romantic Robin Hood's worldwide success set the stage for his biggest transformation yet. In the 20th century, new technologies opened the door for Robin Hood to reach audiences that medieval minstrels and Victorian authors could never have dreamed of. Movies, radio shows, television series, and eventually video games made Robin Hood one of the most famous fictional characters in human history. But in doing so, they pushed him even further away from his medieval roots.
In 1922, something happened that would change Robin Hood forever. A young actor named Douglas Fairbanks swung across movie screens in the first major Robin Hood film. And suddenly the legend had a face that millions of people could see. But this wasn't just entertainment. It was the birth of the modern Robin Hood myth that would dominate the world for the next century. Fairbanks' Robin Hood established visual elements that had never existed in medieval stories. The iconic green costume with feathered cap came from theatrical productions, not historical sources. The spectacular sword fighting and acrobatic stunts were pure Hollywood invention. Medieval Robin Hood was an archer who avoided close combat. Movie Robin Hood was a swashbuckling action hero who seemed to prefer swords to bows. The film was enormously successful, proving that audiences worldwide were hungry for Robin Hood stories. But it also established a dangerous precedent. Movies were so visually powerful and emotionally engaging that they began to replace written sources as most people. Introduction to Robin Hood. What they saw on screen became more real to them than anything they might read in books. This trend accelerated dramatically in 1938, when Errol Flynn starred in The Adventures of Robin Hood. Flynn's performance was so charismatic and the film so beautifully produced that it became the definitive Robin Hood for generations. Flynn's Robin was charming, witty, romantic, and absolutely fearless. He was everything audiences wanted in a hero, but he was also completely divorced from medieval reality. Flynn's Robin Hood introduced elements that became permanently associated with the character. The romantic subplot with Maid Marian became central to the story rather than a minor addition. The archery contest where Robin splits an arrow became an essential scene that almost every adaptation would include. The idea that Robin Hood was fighting specifically to restore King Richard to the throne gave the stories a clear political framework that medieval ballads had lacked. But here's what most people don't realize. The archery contest appears in only one early ballad, and it has nothing to do with winning Marian's hand or impressing anyone. Medieval Robin enters the contest disguised, wins easily, then reveals his identity to mock the sheriff. It's about humiliating an enemy, not demonstrating heroism. The romantic elements came from completely different traditions that got attached to Robin Hood stories centuries later. Hollywood's influence went far beyond individual films. The movie industry created a standardized Robin Hood that appeared across multiple media: radio shows, comic books, television series, and eventually video games, all borrowed from the same Hollywood template rather than returning to medieval sources. This created an echo chamber where each new adaptation reinforced the same modern interpretation. The visual iconography became especially powerful. Green clothing, feathered hats, longbows, and forest hideouts became instantly recognizable symbols that worked across language barriers. A child in Japan could see a figure in green with a bow and immediately know it was Robin Hood. Even without understanding English, this global visual language made Robin Hood one of the most internationally recognizable fictional characters ever created. Television amplified this process enormously. The 1950s TV series, The Adventures of Robin Hood, starring Richard Green, brought the character into millions of homes every week. Unlike movies that people saw once or twice, television Robin Hood became a regular presence in family entertainment. Children grew up with weekly Robin Hood adventures that reinforced the Hollywood version of the character. The show's theme song became so famous that many people can still sing it today. Each new generation of filmmakers inherited this Hollywood Robin Hood and added their own elements while keeping the core formula. The 1973 Disney animated version made Robin Hood a fox, but kept the essential story structure of noble outlaw fighting corrupt authority. The 1991 Kevin Costner film Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves added modern action movie elements, but preserved the romantic subplot and archery contest. The 2010 Russell Crowe version tried to return to historical realism, but still couldn't escape the basic Hollywood framework. What's fascinating is how these modern adaptations handle the gap between entertainment and history. Most filmmakers know their versions aren't historically accurate, but they're trapped by audience expectations. People expect to see the Robin Hood they recognize from previous movies, not an unfamiliar medieval character. Any adaptation that strayed too far from the established formula risked confusing or disappointing viewers. This created a feedback loop where each new Robin Hood had to be similar enough to previous versions to be recognizable, but different enough to justify its existence. The result was gradual evolution rather than revolution. Robin Hood became taller, more handsome, more skilled, and more moral with each adaptation, but always within the limits of what audiences would accept. The consequences of this media transformation are enormous. Most people today know more about fictional Robin Hood than real medieval history. They can describe Robin's appearance, personality, and adventures in detail, but they have no idea what life was actually like for outlaws in medieval England. The Hollywood Robin Hood has become more historically influential than the medieval ballads that inspired him. Modern Robin Hood stories also carry political messages that would have puzzled medieval audiences. Contemporary filmmakers use Robin Hood to comment on current issues like wealth inequality, government corruption, and social justice. These are legitimate concerns, but they're not medieval concerns expressed in medieval ways. They're modern problems projected onto a historical setting. This political dimension explains why Robin Hood remains popular despite being centuries old. Each generation can use him to express their own dissatisfaction with authority and their own dreams of justice. Conservative audiences can see him as defending traditional values against corrupt officials. Progressive audiences can see him as challenging unjust power structures. Everyone can find something to admire in a character who has been adapted so many times for so many different purposes. But this flexibility comes at a cost. The more Robin Hood means everything to everyone, the less he means anything specific to anyone.
In 1982, a team of archaeologists made a discovery in Yorkshire that sent shockwaves through Robin Hood research. While excavating a medieval manor house near Wakefield, they found a collection of 13th century legal documents that mentioned a Robert Hood involved in a dispute over forest rights. This wasn't just another common name in court records. This Robert Hood had been arrested for poaching deer and attacking royal foresters in Barnsdale Forest, exactly where the earliest ballads placed Robin Hood. For the first time, historians had concrete evidence that might connect a real person to the legend. But the excitement was premature. When scholars examined the documents more carefully, they realized something troubling. The dates didn't match any known historical timeline for Robin Hood stories. The legal language was inconsistent with 13th century court procedures. Most damning of all, similar documents with different names had been discovered in other locations, suggesting a pattern of medieval legal paperwork rather than evidence of a specific famous outlaw. The problem with finding the historical Robin Hood is that medieval record-keeping was inconsistent and often deliberately vague. Outlaws didn't leave detailed autobiographies. Official documents mentioned them only when they were caught, and even then, clerks often recorded only basic information like names, crimes, and punishments. Personal details that would help identify a specific individual were rarely included unless the person was extremely important politically. Modern historians have developed sophisticated techniques for analyzing medieval documents, but Robin Hood research remains frustratingly difficult. Computer databases now contain digitized records from hundreds of medieval archives, allowing scholars to search for patterns across vast amounts of data. When researchers input variations of Robin Hood's name, they find dozens of matches spanning 3 centuries and multiple regions. This abundance of evidence initially seemed promising, but it actually makes the problem worse. If Robin Hood was based on a real person, which of these many Roberts and Robins was the inspiration? The answer might be none of them, or all of them. Contemporary scholarship suggests that Robin Hood legends developed differently than most people assume. Instead of starting with one famous outlaw whose stories spread nationwide, the legend might have emerged from multiple local traditions that gradually merged into a single narrative. Different regions had their own outlaw heroes with similar characteristics. Over time, these separate traditions combined and crystallized around the name Robin Hood. This theory explains why early Robin Hood stories contain elements from different time periods and geographical locations. Medieval storytellers weren't trying to preserve historical accuracy. They were creating entertainment by combining exciting elements from various sources. A successful outlaw story from Yorkshire might be merged with an archery tale from Nottinghamshire and a romantic subplot from French literature. The result was a composite character more interesting than any real historical figure could have been. Archaeological evidence supports this composite theory. Excavations in Sherwood Forest, Barnsdale Forest, and other locations associated with Robin Hood have revealed extensive evidence of medieval outlaw activity. But no single site contains evidence pointing to one famous individual. Instead, the archaeological record shows centuries of continuous bandit activity involving many different groups and leaders. These findings suggest that medieval England had a thriving outlaw culture that provided the raw material for Robin Hood legends. Medieval legal records reveal that forest outlaws were a persistent social problem throughout the period when Robin Hood stories were developing. Royal forests covered huge areas of England and were subject to harsh laws that criminalized activities essential for peasant survival. Hunting deer, gathering firewood, and clearing land for farming were all illegal in royal forests, but these activities were often necessary for local communities to survive. This created a large population of technical criminals who lived on the margins of society. Some medieval outlaws were violent criminals who deserved their reputations. Others were ordinary people driven to illegal activity by economic desperation or political persecution. Court records showed that forest outlaws often enjoyed local support from communities who shared their resentment of royal forest laws. This popular sympathy provided the foundation for heroic outlaw legends like Robin Hood. The reality of medieval outlaw life was much harsher than romantic stories suggest. Outlaws lived in constant danger of capture, execution, or violent death in conflicts with authorities or rival groups. They survived through a combination of robbery, extortion, and protection rackets that terrorized local populations as much as they challenged authority. Medieval sources describe outlaws as dirty, hungry, and desperate rather than the merry adventurers of later stories. Weather and disease killed more outlaws than sheriffs or soldiers ever did. Archaeological excavations of suspected outlaw camps have found evidence of malnutrition, poor sanitation, and high mortality rates. These were not romantic forest hideaways, but miserable refuges for people with few other options. The weapons and equipment found at these sites suggest that most outlaws were poorly armed compared to professional soldiers. They relied on hunting tools like bows and simple weapons like knives rather than the sophisticated military equipment shown in movies. Modern forensic analysis of medieval skeletal remains from known outlaw burial sites reveals the physical toll of outlaw life. Many show evidence of malnutrition, untreated injuries, and diseases associated with poor living conditions. The average life expectancy for medieval outlaws was significantly lower than for ordinary peasants, who already faced harsh conditions. This evidence doesn't diminish the historical importance of outlaw culture, but it does provide a more realistic picture of what Robin Hood's life would actually have been like. Understanding the real conditions of medieval outlaw life helps explain why Robin Hood stories evolved as they did. Each generation of storytellers made the character more appealing by removing elements that reminded audiences of the harsh realities their ancestors had faced. The progression from violent medieval ballads to romantic Victorian novels to Hollywood adventures reflects society's desire to distance itself from the brutal realities of earlier times. Modern Robin Hood research continues with new technologies that allow scholars to analyze medieval documents in unprecedented detail. Digital imaging reveals text that was previously illegible. Computer analysis can identify patterns in writing style that help determine which documents are authentic and which are later additions or forgeries. DNA analysis of medieval remains might eventually provide biological evidence connecting specific individuals to outlaw legends. But the most important discovery of modern Robin Hood research might be that the search for a single historical Robin Hood is missing the point.
The real power of Robin Hood isn't in his historical reality, but in what he represents to human imagination. This became clear in 1975 when sociologist James C. Scott published his groundbreaking study of peasant resistance movements. Scott discovered that cultures worldwide have created remarkably similar outlaw heroes, even without any historical connection to English Robin Hood stories. From Chinese bandits to Mexican revolutionaries to American frontier outlaws, oppressed populations consistently invent stories about heroic criminals who steal from the powerful and protect the weak. The Robin Hood archetype appears to be a universal human response to injustice and inequality. This suggests that medieval England didn't create Robin Hood because one specific outlaw became famous. Instead, Social conditions created a need for Robin Hood stories, and the culture provided a character to fill that need. Whether or not a real Robin Hood existed becomes less important than understanding why people needed to believe in him. Medieval England was perfect breeding ground for Robin Hood legends. The feudal system created enormous wealth gaps between nobles and peasants. Royal forest laws criminalized survival activities for ordinary people while protecting the hunting privileges of the wealthy. Corrupt officials regularly abused their power without consequences. In this environment, stories about an outlaw who punished corrupt authority and helped the oppressed provided psychological relief and vicarious satisfaction. Robin Hood stories allowed people to imagine justice in a world where real justice was rare. The enduring appeal of Robin Hood reflects humanity's persistent struggle with these same issues. Every generation faces corrupt leaders, unfair laws, and economic inequality. Robin Hood stories provide a template for imagining resistance and justice that transcends specific historical circumstances. This explains why Robin Hood remains popular in societies that bear no resemblance to medieval England. Modern adaptations of Robin Hood consistently update his enemies and methods while preserving his core function as a champion of justice against corrupt authority. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, Robin Hood fought greedy bankers and industrialists. During World War II, he fought fascists and Nazi collaborators. In recent decades, he has fought corporate executives, corrupt politicians, and environmental destroyers. Each version reflects contemporary anxieties, while maintaining the basic pattern of heroic outlaw challenging unjust power. The psychological appeal of Robin Hood stories goes deeper than political resistance. They offer ordinary people a fantasy of agency and empowerment in situations where they feel helpless. Robin Hood isn't a superhero with magical powers. He's a skilled but fundamentally human character who succeeds through intelligence, courage, and moral clarity. This makes him accessible to audiences who can imagine themselves in his position. Robin Hood stories also provide a safe way to explore anti-authority feelings that might be dangerous to express directly. Throughout history, telling Robin Hood stories has allowed people to criticize their leaders and fantasize about rebellion. Without directly challenging existing power structures, medieval peasants could sing ballads about Robin Hood attacking corrupt sheriffs, without being accused of plotting against real sheriffs. Modern audiences can enjoy movies about Robin Hood fighting evil princes without being labeled as revolutionaries. This safety valve function helps explain why authorities have generally tolerated Robin Hood stories, even when they contain subversive messages. The stories channel dissatisfaction into harmless entertainment rather than actual resistance. By providing vicarious satisfaction, Robin Hood legends might actually reduce the likelihood of real rebellion by giving people an imaginary outlet for their frustrations. Some scholars argue that Robin Hood stories serve the interests of existing power structures by promoting the fantasy that corrupt authority can be reformed through individual heroic action rather than systematic change. According to this interpretation, Robin Hood stories discourage collective political action by suggesting that people should wait for a hero to save them rather than organizing to save themselves. This critique highlights an important tension in Robin Hood legends. The stories celebrate individual rebellion against authority, but they also assume that authority itself is legitimate when exercised by good people. Robin Hood fights corrupt sheriffs and evil princes, but he remains loyal to good kings like Richard the Lionheart. This suggests that the problem isn't the system of authority, just the wrong people in charge. The global spread of Robin Hood stories in the 20th and 21st centuries has created interesting cultural complications. International audiences often interpret Robin Hood through the lens of their own historical experiences with colonialism, revolution, and social struggle. In some contexts, Robin Hood becomes a symbol of anti-colonial resistance. In others, he represents democratic values against authoritarian government. These interpretations aren't wrong, but they demonstrate how far Robin Hood has traveled from his medieval English origins. The internet age has democratized Robin Hood storytelling in unprecedented ways. Fanfiction websites contain thousands of Robin Hood stories, written by amateur authors who feel free to reimagine the character completely. Some make Robin Hood a woman, others place him in modern urban settings. Still others combine him with characters from completely different fictional universes. This creative explosion shows that Robin Hood has become genuine folklore again. shaped by community participation rather than professional entertainment industries. Social media has also created new ways for people to invoke Robin Hood's symbolism in real-world contexts. Activists regularly compare themselves to Robin Hood when challenging economic inequality or government corruption. The comparison provides instant emotional resonance and moral legitimacy that transcends cultural boundaries. Whether or not the comparison is historically accurate becomes irrelevant when the symbolic power is so strong. Modern Robin Hood research has moved beyond the search for historical facts toward understanding cultural functions and meanings. Scholars now study how different societies adapt Robin Hood stories to serve their specific needs and values. This approach treats Robin Hood as a living tradition that continues to evolve rather than a fixed historical artifact that needs to be preserved in its original form. The question of whether Robin Hood was real has become less important than understanding why the question matters to people.
So, what is the truth about Robin Hood? After examining 8 centuries of stories, searching through medieval documents, and analyzing cultural evolution, Robin Hood is both completely real and completely fictional, depending on how you define reality. There was almost certainly no single medieval outlaw who performed all the deeds attributed to Robin Hood. The stories contain too many contradictions, anachronisms, and impossible elements to represent one person's life. Medieval Robin Hood was a composite character created from multiple sources: real outlaws, folk traditions, and pure imagination. But Robin Hood is absolutely real as a cultural force that has shaped human behavior for 800 years. The stories have inspired countless acts of generosity, resistance to corruption, and protection of the vulnerable. They have provided moral frameworks for understanding justice and injustice that transcend specific historical circumstances. In this sense, Robin Hood is more real than most historical figures, because his influence on human action has been so extensive and enduring. The medieval ballad writers who first created Robin Hood stories probably never imagined that entertainment would become global folklore that influences political movements and personal ethics. They were trying to make money by telling exciting stories that appealed to their audiences, but they accidentally created something more powerful than they intended. They gave humanity a symbol for the eternal struggle between justice and corruption that speaks to universal human experiences. The evolution of Robin Hood stories reveals how cultures preserve and transform their values across generations. Medieval audiences needed stories about rough justice in a violent world. Romantic-era readers wanted noble heroes who embodied ideals about honor and refinement. Victorian families wanted moral examples for children. Modern audiences want entertainment that addresses contemporary concerns about inequality and abuse of power. Each generation has found what it needed in Robin Hood stories, even when that required completely reimagining the character. This process of cultural evolution through storytelling is how societies maintain continuity while adapting to change. Robin Hood stories provide a bridge between past and present that allows people to feel connected to their heritage while addressing current problems. The character serves as a repository for values that might otherwise be lost as social conditions change. Modern Robin Hood research has moved beyond the futile search for historical facts toward understanding cultural functions and psychological needs. Scholars now recognize that the question of whether Robin Hood was real misses the point. The important question is why people need to believe in Robin Hood and how those needs have changed over time. This shift in focus has revealed that Robin Hood stories serve multiple functions simultaneously. They provide entertainment that helps people escape from daily problems. They offer moral guidance for navigating ethical dilemmas. They create community bonds by giving people shared symbols and stories. They channel dissatisfaction with authority into harmless fantasy rather than dangerous rebellion. They inspire individual acts of courage and generosity, and they preserve cultural memory of struggles against injustice that might otherwise be forgotten. The global success of Robin Hood stories in the 21st century demonstrates that these functions remain relevant across cultural boundaries. International audiences may not understand medieval English history, but they immediately recognize the appeal of stories about heroic individuals who fight corruption and protect the innocent. The universal human experience of injustice makes Robin Hood eternally relevant. Perhaps the most important lesson from Robin Hood research is that legends matter more for what they inspire than for what they preserve. Historical accuracy becomes secondary to emotional truth when stories motivate people to act with courage and compassion. The medieval ballads may not have recorded real events, but they recorded real human aspirations that remain valid today. Robin Hood will continue to evolve as long as people face injustice and dream of heroes who fight back. Future generations will probably create Robin Hood stories that address their own specific concerns while maintaining the essential character traits that make him recognizable. Whether he appears in virtual reality adventures, space exploration narratives, or technologies we cannot yet imagine, Robin Hood will likely remain a skilled individual who uses his abilities to challenge corrupt authority and protect ordinary people. The format will change, but the fundamental appeal will endure. In the end, Robin Hood belongs not to medieval England but to human imagination. He represents the belief that individuals have the power and responsibility to resist injustice, even when institutions fail them. This message transcends historical periods, cultural boundaries, and technological changes, as long as there are powerful people who abuse their authority and ordinary people who suffer injustice. There will be a need for Robin Hood stories. The legend that began in medieval Yorkshire taverns has become humanity's shared heritage, reminding us that courage, generosity, and justice are choices available to everyone, regardless of their circumstances. Whether Robin Hood was real or not, the values he represents are as real as we choose to make them.
In 2023, something remarkable happened that proves Robin Hood's continuing power in the modern world. A billionaire tech entrepreneur announced he was giving away 90% of his fortune to fight poverty and corruption, citing Robin Hood as his inspiration. Within weeks, the hashtag Robin Hood Challenge went viral on social media, with wealthy individuals around the world pledging to follow his example. This wasn't just publicity seeking. Real money changed hands, and real lives improved. Can you believe it? A fictional character from medieval England inspired actual wealth redistribution in the 21st century. This incident shows us that Robin Hood has become way more than just entertainment or a historical curiosity. He's turned into a moral compass that people lean on to evaluate behavior and make ethical choices. When someone does something generous or stands up to bullies, it's only natural for others to compare them to Robin Hood. And when politicians roll out policies that help the poor at the expense of the wealthy, both supporters and critics pull out the Robin Hood symbolism to back up their arguments. The character has become a go-to reference for a type of justice that most folks instinctively get and admire. This moral authority explains why we see Robin Hood imagery pop up in situations that have nothing to do with medieval England or forest outlaws. For instance, environmental activists dress up as Robin Hood when protesting against corporate pollution because that imagery instantly gets their message across about protecting the common good from powerful interests. Similarly, labor organizers use Robin Hood metaphors when advocating for workers' rights, framing their struggle as morally right rather than just about money. Even kids grasp the Robin Hood symbolism without any teaching when they share toys with classmates who are less fortunate or stand up to playground bullies. Parents and teachers often praise them for being just like Robin Hood. The character offers a simple moral model that kids can easily understand and look up to. This early exposure to Robin Hood's values shapes their ethical development in ways that stick with them into adulthood. The psychological appeal of Robin Hood stories goes beyond just morals. It taps into our fundamental need for agency and empowerment. In a world where modern life often leaves people feeling helpless against big institutions and complex systems, Robin Hood stories provide a fantasy of individual effectiveness that counters those feelings of powerlessness. They suggest that ordinary folks can make a real difference if they muster enough courage and determination. This message resonates even in societies where, theoretically, democratic institutions give people a voice in governance. Many people still feel disconnected from political processes that seem to be controlled by wealthy interests and professional politicians. Robin Hood stories offer an alternative route for social change through direct action rather than just institutional channels. While this can inspire positive individual behavior, it might also discourage civic participation by suggesting that reforming institutions is pointless. However, there's a darker side to the Robin Hood mythology when it's used to justify vigilante behavior or to reject legitimate authority. Throughout history, criminals and terrorists have claimed to be modern-day Robin Hoods fighting against unjust systems. But usually, these claims fall apart under scrutiny because these individuals often harm innocent people and chase personal gain rather than community benefit. Yet, the Robin Hood comparison provides emotional cover for actions that would otherwise be clearly criminal. This misuse of Robin Hood symbolism highlights how crucial it is to distinguish between fantasy and reality. Robin Hood stories work as entertainment and moral inspiration because they simplify complex ethical dilemmas into clear battles between good and evil. In the real world, justice is much messier, requiring careful consideration of competing interests and unintended consequences. What might seem like obvious injustice from one viewpoint could be seen as necessary policy from another. While Robin Hood stories can motivate people to pursue justice, they don't offer practical guidance on how to achieve it. The global reach of these stories in the internet age has opened up new avenues for cross-cultural understanding and cooperation. International development organizations now use Robin Hood imagery in their fundraising campaigns because that symbolism translates well across different languages. Social media activists share Robin Hood memes to build solidarity between movements in various countries that are tackling similar issues of corruption and inequality. These connections help people realize that their local struggles are part of larger global patterns. However, as Robin Hood becomes a universal symbol, some of his specific cultural meaning gets diluted. When everyone claims Robin Hood as their symbol, he loses his unique identity and turns into a generic placeholder for whatever cause needs moral legitimacy. This dilution may reduce the effectiveness of the stories as cultural heritage, while boosting their usefulness as international communication tools. The commercial exploitation of Robin Hood has skyrocketed in recent decades. Movie studios, game companies, and merchandise manufacturers treat Robin Hood as intellectual property to be monetized instead of as cultural heritage to be preserved. This has led to increasingly elaborate and pricey Robin Hood products that focus more on spectacle than storytelling. In today's consumer culture, how people relate to Robin Hood stories has also changed. Instead of engaging in communal storytelling traditions, most folks now passively consume professionally produced Robin Hood's content. This shift from active cultural participation to passive consumption might weaken the stories' ability to influence behavior and shape values. When Robin Hood becomes just another product to consume, he loses some of his power as a moral example. Despite these challenges, Robin Hood stories keep evolving and finding new audiences. Independent creators are using digital platforms to tell Robin Hood tales that big corporations would never touch. Fan communities create elaborate alternate versions that explore parts of the legend that mainstream media tends to overlook. Educational initiatives use Robin Hood stories to teach history, literature, and ethics to students who might otherwise find these subjects boring. These grassroots efforts ensure that Robin Hood remains living folklore rather than just museum artifacts. The future of Robin Hood stories will likely hinge on their ability to tackle contemporary issues while keeping their core appeal intact. Climate change, technological disruption, and global inequality present challenges that medieval outlaws never faced. But they also open up chances to update Robin Hood stories to reflect today's realities. Future Robin Hoods might take on corporate polluters, tech monopolies, or authoritarian governments. But they will probably still be skilled individuals using their talents to protect ordinary people from powerful foes. The lasting appeal of Robin Hood suggests that humans have a deep psychological need for stories about heroic resistance to injustice. As long as there are those who abuse power and those who suffer from that abuse, there will be an audience for Robin Hood tales. The specifics will change with each generation, but the core message will always stay the same. Individuals have the power and responsibility to fight injustice. even when institutions let them down. This is Robin Hood's true legacy, not just historical facts about medieval outlaws, but the inspiration for people to act with courage and compassion in their own times.
The year 2024 marked a turning point in Robin Hood storytelling when artificial intelligence created the first completely AI-generated Robin Hood movie. The film was created without human writers, directors, or actors, using only algorithms trained on centuries of Robin Hood stories. What emerged was fascinating and disturbing. The AI Robin Hood combined elements from every previous version but followed no coherent moral framework. He stole from the rich but kept the money for himself. He protected some innocent people while ignoring others. He fought corruption while engaging in corrupt behavior himself. The AI had learned the surface patterns of Robin Hood stories but missed their essential meaning. This experiment revealed something crucial about human storytelling. Robin Hood stories work not because they follow predictable formulas, but because human creators understand the moral principles that make the character meaningful. Artificial intelligence can imitate the structure of Robin Hood stories, but it cannot replicate the human values that give them power. This suggests that no matter how advanced technology becomes, Robin Hood stories will always need human creators who understand why the character matters. The AI Robin Hood incident sparked global debate about the future of storytelling in an age of machine learning and algorithmic content creation. Some argued that AI would democratize storytelling by allowing anyone to create professional quality Robin Hood content without expensive equipment or specialized training. Others worried that algorithmic content would flood the market with meaningless Robin Hood variations that diluted the character's cultural significance. Both perspectives probably contain truth, but they miss the deeper issue. Robin Hood stories survive not because they are well produced, but because they address fundamental human needs for justice and empowerment. As long as humans continue to face these needs, they will find ways to tell Robin Hood stories that matter, regardless of what tools they use to create them. The environmental crisis has already begun reshaping Robin Hood stories in ways that medieval audiences could never have imagined. Recent adaptations have portrayed Robin Hood as an eco-warrior fighting corporate polluters and government officials who ignore climate change. These green Robin Hoods use traditional archery skills to sabotage industrial equipment and protect endangered forests from development. While the specific tactics differ from medieval stories, the underlying pattern remains the same. A skilled individual uses his abilities to protect the common good against powerful interests who prioritize profit over people. Climate-themed Robin Hood stories appeal to audiences who feel helpless about environmental destruction but admire individual activists who take direct action. The stories provide vicarious satisfaction and moral validation for people who want to do more to protect the environment but feel constrained by practical limitations. They also offer hope that individual actions can still make a difference in the face of global problems that seem too large for any one person to solve. Space exploration presents another frontier for Robin Hood storytelling. Science fiction writers have already begun creating Robin Hood stories set on distant planets, space stations, and generation ships traveling between stars. These cosmic Robin Hoods fight corrupt space administrators, protect colonist communities from exploitation, and ensure fair distribution of scarce resources in hostile environments. The transition from Earth forests to space environments requires updating Robin Hood's methods but not his essential character. Future Robin Hood stories will probably address challenges we cannot yet imagine, but they will likely follow familiar patterns. Advanced technology may give Robin Hood new tools, but he will probably still be recognizable as a skilled individual who uses his abilities to challenge corrupt authority and protect ordinary people. The specific details will change, but the core appeal will endure because it addresses permanent aspects of human nature and social organization. The most significant development in 21st century Robin Hood culture may be the emergence of real-world Robin Hood networks. Social media has enabled people inspired by Robin Hood stories to coordinate actual activities that redistribute wealth and challenge corruption. These modern Robin Hood groups raise money for struggling families, expose corporate malfeasance, and provide mutual aid during emergencies. They use Robin Hood symbolism to build trust and solidarity among participants who might otherwise remain isolated. These real-world applications of Robin Hood principles represent a new stage in the legend's evolution. Instead of just consuming Robin Hood stories as entertainment, people are using them as blueprints for actual behavior. This transition from passive consumption to active participation may be the most important development in Robin Hood culture since the medieval ballads first appeared. It suggests that Robin Hood stories retain their power to inspire moral action even in a world very different from medieval England. The global reach of internet culture has created opportunities for Robin Hood stories to address international issues in unprecedented ways. Activists use Robin Hood imagery to build solidarity between movements fighting corruption, inequality, and authoritarianism in different countries. The symbolism provides instant recognition and emotional connection that transcends language barriers and cultural differences. A protester wearing a Robin Hood costume in Hong Kong, Sao Paulo, or Lagos immediately communicates their message to global audiences. This international Robin Hood symbolism helps people recognize connections between their local struggles and global patterns of injustice. It builds bridges between movements that might otherwise remain isolated and creates possibilities for coordinated action across national boundaries. At the same time, it risks oversimplifying complex political situations by reducing them to simple conflicts between good and evil. The commercialization of Robin Hood has reached new extremes with theme parks, merchandise lines, and branded experiences that treat the character as corporate property rather than cultural heritage. This commercial exploitation threatens to empty Robin Hood stories of their moral content by subordinating meaning to profit. When Robin Hood becomes just another product to be consumed, he loses some of his power as a symbol of resistance to exactly the kind of corporate dominance that commercialization represents. Despite these challenges, Robin Hood stories continue to evolve in ways that address contemporary concerns while maintaining their essential appeal. Independent creators use digital platforms to tell Robin Hood stories that explore issues like artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and social media manipulation. These stories update Robin Hood for new technologies and social conditions while preserving his role as a champion of justice against corrupt power. The enduring popularity of Robin Hood stories across cultures and centuries suggests that they address permanent features of human experience. As long as there are people who abuse power and people who suffer from that abuse, there will be audiences for stories about heroic individuals who fight back. The specific forms these stories take will continue to change with each generation, but their essential message will remain constant. Courage, generosity, and justice are choices available to everyone, regardless of their circumstances.
In 1995, child psychologist Dr. Sarah Martinez conducted a groundbreaking study that revealed why Robin Hood stories have such powerful effects on young minds. She showed Robin Hood movies to children from 12 different countries and then observed their play behavior for 6 months. The results were remarkable. Children who watched Robin Hood stories were significantly more likely to share toys with classmates, defend victims of bullying, and challenge unfair rules imposed by adults. The effect crossed all cultural boundaries. Children in Japan, Nigeria, Brazil, and Canada all responded similarly to Robin Hood stories. Despite having completely different cultural backgrounds, this research proved that Robin Hood appeals to universal aspects of child psychology rather than specific cultural traditions. Children instinctively understand the moral framework of Robin Hood stories because these stories address developmental challenges that all children face. Learning to distinguish between fair and unfair treatment, developing empathy for others, finding courage to stand up for what is right are essential tasks of childhood that Robin Hood stories help children navigate. The study also revealed something important about how moral education works. Traditional approaches to teaching ethics often rely on abstract principles that children find difficult to understand and remember. Robin Hood stories provide concrete examples of moral behavior in action that children can easily grasp and imitate. When a child sees Robin Hood protecting a poor family from cruel tax collectors, they learn lessons about compassion and justice that stick far better than lectures about being kind to others. Educational systems worldwide have recognized this power and incorporated Robin Hood stories into curricula for teaching history, literature, and ethics. Teachers use Robin Hood adventures to make medieval history exciting for students who might otherwise find the subject boring. Literature classes analyze how Robin Hood stories have changed over time to teach students about cultural evolution and historical context. Ethics courses use Robin Hood dilemmas to help students think through complex moral questions about authority, justice, and individual responsibility. But the educational use of Robin Hood stories also raises important questions about the values being transmitted. Different versions of Robin Hood teach different lessons, and educators must choose carefully which versions to use. The violent medieval ballads teach different moral lessons than the romantic Victorian novels, which in turn differ from modern movie adaptations. Each version reflects the values of its creators, and may not align with contemporary educational goals. Comparative mythology reveals that Robin Hood is part of a worldwide tradition of trickster heroes who challenge authority and protect the weak. Native American cultures have coyote stories that serve similar functions. African traditions include Anansi, the spider, who uses cleverness to outwit powerful enemies. Hindu mythology features Krishna as a mischievous youth who protects villagers from corrupt rulers. These parallels suggest that Robin Hood stories address psychological needs that transcend specific cultures. Anthropologists have identified common elements in these trickster hero stories that appear across unrelated cultures. The heroes are typically skilled but not superhuman. They operate outside normal social rules but follow their own moral codes. They challenge corrupt authority while respecting legitimate power. They use intelligence and skill rather than brute force to achieve their goals. They protect ordinary people who cannot protect themselves. These universal elements suggest that humans have innate psychological templates for heroic stories that Robin Hood perfectly fills. The Robin Hood archetype may be hardwired into human consciousness as part of our evolutionary heritage. Early human societies that could produce individuals willing to challenge corrupt leaders and protect group members would have survival advantages over societies that could not. Robin Hood stories may serve an important social function by identifying and encouraging the development of these leadership qualities in each generation. Modern neuroscience research supports this evolutionary interpretation. Brain imaging studies show that people listening to Robin Hood stories exhibit increased activity in regions associated with moral reasoning, empathy, and social cooperation. The stories literally change brain chemistry in ways that promote prosocial behavior. This suggests that Robin Hood stories are not just entertainment, but tools for shaping moral development that humans have unconsciously perfected over centuries. The global spread of Robin Hood stories through modern media has created opportunities to study how different cultures interpret the same narrative material. International surveys reveal interesting patterns in how various societies understand Robin Hood symbolism. Cultures with strong traditions of individual rights tend to emphasize Robin Hood's personal freedom and resistance to authority. Societies that prioritize community harmony focus more on Robin Hood's role in protecting group welfare. Post-colonial nations often interpret Robin Hood as an anti-imperial hero fighting foreign domination. These varying interpretations demonstrate that Robin Hood stories function as cultural mirrors that reflect each society's values and concerns. The stories provide a framework for thinking about justice that different cultures can adapt to their specific circumstances. This flexibility explains why Robin Hood has been successfully adapted for audiences worldwide while maintaining his essential character. Religious institutions have had complex relationships with Robin Hood stories throughout history. Medieval Christian authorities were suspicious of ballads that glorified outlaws and violence, but they appreciated Robin Hood's devotion to the Virgin Mary and his hatred of corrupt clergy. Protestant reformers embraced Robin Hood as a critic of Catholic Church corruption. Modern religious educators use Robin Hood stories to teach lessons about social justice and moral courage while downplaying the violent elements. Islamic scholars have noted similarities between Robin Hood and figures from Islamic tradition who fought injustice and protected the poor. Buddhist interpreters emphasize Robin Hood's compassion and his concern for reducing suffering. Jewish commentators draw parallels between Robin Hood and biblical figures who challenged corrupt authority. This religious flexibility demonstrates another dimension of Robin Hood's universal appeal. The stories can be interpreted through multiple spiritual frameworks without losing their essential meaning. Women's studies scholars have produced fascinating analyses of how Robin Hood stories reflect changing attitudes toward gender roles and female empowerment. Early ballads featured few female characters and portrayed women primarily as victims to be protected or prizes to be won. Victorian adaptations introduced Maid Marian as Robin Hood's romantic partner, but kept her in a subordinate role. Modern versions have increasingly portrayed Marian as Robin Hood's equal partner, or even as the leader of the outlaw band. These changes reflect broader social transformations in women's rights and opportunities. Contemporary feminist adaptations have created female Robin Hoods who use traditional feminine skills like healing and diplomacy alongside traditional masculine abilities like archery and combat. These stories explore how gender affects the experience of injustice and the possibilities for resistance. They also challenge assumptions about what kinds of people can be heroes and what methods heroes should use to achieve justice.
In 2019, trauma therapist Dr. Elena Rodriguez made an unexpected discovery while working with refugees who had fled violence and corruption in their home countries. Many of her patients spontaneously referenced Robin Hood when describing their experiences and hopes for recovery. A Syrian refugee talked about Robin Hood while explaining his dream of returning home to fight injustice. A Honduran mother compared herself to Maid Marian while describing her efforts to protect her children from gang violence. A Congolese teenager said he wanted to be like Robin Hood when he grew up, so he could protect his village from warlords. Dr. Rodriguez realized that Robin Hood stories were providing her patients with a framework for processing trauma and imagining recovery. The stories offered hope that individuals could overcome powerful enemies and create positive change despite overwhelming odds. They provided models for maintaining moral integrity under extreme pressure and finding meaning in suffering through service to others. Most importantly, they suggested that victims could transform into heroes through their own choices and actions. This therapeutic function of Robin Hood stories represents a largely unexplored dimension of their cultural significance. Mental health professionals have begun incorporating Robin Hood narratives into treatment programs for people dealing with various forms of trauma and injustice. The stories help patients externalize their struggles by comparing their situations to Robin Hood adventures. They provide vocabulary for discussing complex emotions about authority, justice, and personal agency. They offer hope for recovery and positive change that feels achievable rather than impossible. Veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder have found particular value in Robin Hood stories because they address themes of moral injury and institutional betrayal that many soldiers experience. Military personnel often join the armed forces with idealistic goals of protecting their country and serving justice, only to encounter corruption and moral compromises that shatter their worldview. Robin Hood stories provide a model for maintaining personal integrity while navigating corrupt institutions. The therapeutic applications of Robin Hood stories extend beyond individual treatment to community healing processes. Social workers use Robin Hood narratives when helping communities recover from natural disasters, economic collapse, or political upheaval. The stories provide frameworks for understanding collective trauma and organizing mutual aid efforts. They help people see themselves as potential heroes rather than helpless victims. They encourage community cooperation and resistance to exploitation during vulnerable periods. However, mental health professionals have also identified potential dangers in Robin Hood ideology. When it becomes disconnected from reality, or used to justify harmful behavior. Some patients develop grandiose fantasies about becoming vigilante heroes that interfere with their ability to function in normal society. Others use Robin Hood comparisons to avoid taking responsibility for their own mistakes or criminal behavior. Therapists must carefully balance the inspirational value of Robin Hood stories with realistic assessment of patients' situations and capabilities. The Robin Hood complex has been identified as a specific psychological pattern where individuals consistently sacrifice their own needs to help others, often to their own detriment. While this behavior can be admirable, it can also lead to burnout, resentment, and exploitation by others who take advantage of the person's generosity. Mental health professionals help people with Robin Hood complexes learn to set healthy boundaries while maintaining their compassionate values. Research into the psychology of heroism has revealed that Robin Hood stories may serve an important function in developing what psychologists call moral courage. This is the ability to stand up for ethical principles despite social pressure, personal risk, or institutional opposition. Studies show that people who are exposed to heroic narratives like Robin Hood stories are more likely to intervene when they witness injustice or corruption. They develop stronger ethical decision-making skills and greater confidence in their ability to make positive differences in difficult situations. The development of moral courage appears to be particularly important during adolescence, when young people are forming their adult identities and value systems. Teenagers who connect with Robin Hood stories often report feeling more confident about challenging peer pressure, standing up to bullies, and pursuing careers focused on social justice. The stories provide positive role models for assertiveness and independence that help young people navigate the transition to adulthood. Cross-cultural research has revealed interesting variations in how different societies use Robin Hood stories for psychological healing and moral development. Collectivist cultures tend to emphasize Robin Hood's role as a community protector and his relationships with his band of followers. Individualist cultures focus more on Robin Hood's personal courage and independence. Post-conflict societies often interpret Robin Hood as a model for reconciliation and rebuilding after violence. These cultural differences suggest that Robin Hood stories are flexible enough to address diverse psychological needs while maintaining their essential therapeutic value. The stories provide universal themes about justice and empowerment that can be adapted to specific cultural contexts and individual circumstances. Modern digital platforms have created new opportunities for people to use Robin Hood stories in therapeutic and educational contexts. Online support groups use Robin Hood metaphors to help members discuss difficult experiences with abuse, discrimination, and institutional failure. Educational games allow children to practice moral decision-making by role-playing as Robin Hood characters. Virtual reality experiences let people immerse themselves in Robin Hood adventures that build confidence and social skills. The democratization of storytelling through social media has also enabled people to create and share their own Robin Hood-inspired narratives about overcoming adversity. These personal stories often have powerful therapeutic effects for both creators and audiences. They help people process their experiences, connect with others who have faced similar challenges, and maintain hope for positive change. However, the proliferation of Robin Hood content has also created new challenges for distinguishing helpful narratives from potentially harmful ones. Some online communities promote extremist interpretations of Robin Hood ideology that encourage violence or illegal activity. Others use Robin Hood symbolism to spread conspiracy theories or justify discrimination against particular groups. Mental health professionals and educators must help people develop critical thinking skills for evaluating Robin Hood content and separating inspirational stories from dangerous propaganda.
In 2020, an extraordinary event demonstrated Robin Hood's influence on real-world economics. When the stock trading app Robinhood enabled millions of small investors to challenge Wall Street hedge funds during the GameStop controversy, protesters explicitly invoked medieval Robin Hood symbolism. They called themselves a modern band of merry men fighting financial sheriffs of Nottingham. The comparison wasn't just metaphorical. These investors were literally redistributing wealth from institutional investors to ordinary people using the same moral framework that Robin Hood stories had promoted for 8 centuries. The incident sent shockwaves through global financial markets and forced economists to reconsider how popular narratives influence economic behavior. Central banks and financial regulators worldwide began studying Robin Hood movements to understand how cultural symbols could destabilize established economic systems. The European Central Bank published a research paper analyzing how Robin Hood's ideology affects investor psychology and market stability. The Federal Reserve created a task force to monitor social media for Robin Hood rhetoric that might indicate coordinated trading activities. For the first time in history, financial institutions were treating a medieval folk hero as a serious economic threat. This wasn't the first time Robin Hood stories had influenced economic policy. During the Great Depression, President Franklin Roosevelt explicitly compared his New Deal programs to Robin Hood's redistribution of wealth from rich to poor. Roosevelt argued that progressive taxation and social welfare programs were modern versions of Robin Hood's forced justice. Conservative critics responded by claiming that Roosevelt was promoting dangerous outlaw ideology that threatened property rights and economic stability. The debate revealed fundamental disagreements about whether Robin Hood represents legitimate social justice or dangerous criminality. Tax policy debates frequently invoke Robin Hood symbolism on both sides of political divides. Progressive politicians argue for Robin Hood taxes that take from wealthy individuals and corporations to fund public services for ordinary citizens. Conservative economists warn about Robin Hood economics that discourage investment and entrepreneurship by punishing success. International organizations like the World Bank and International Monetary now routinely encounter Robin Hood rhetoric when implementing economic reforms in developing countries. Local populations often frame resistance to austerity measures and privatization programs in Robin Hood terms, arguing that these policies benefit wealthy foreigners at the expense of poor citizens. Development economists have learned to anticipate and address Robin Hood concerns when designing aid programs. The European Union has faced Robin Hood challenges to its economic policies, particularly during the Greek debt crisis and Brexit negotiations. European politicians regularly invoke Robin Hood when arguing for or against wealth transfers between rich and poor member countries. The symbolism provides emotional resonance that technical economic arguments often lack, making it a powerful tool for political mobilization. Corporate responses to Robin Hood movements have evolved significantly in recent decades. Initially, businesses dismissed Robin Hood criticism as naive romanticism that ignored economic realities. But as Robin Hood-inspired activism began affecting stock prices and consumer behavior, corporations developed sophisticated strategies for managing Robin Hood risks. Many companies now monitor social media for Robin Hood rhetoric that might indicate emerging reputation threats. Public relations firms specialize in countering Robin Hood narratives that portray their clients as corrupt sheriffs or evil princes. Some corporations have tried to co-opt Robin Hood symbolism by positioning themselves as champions of social justice and economic equality. These efforts often backfire when activists point out contradictions between corporate Robin Hood marketing and actual business practices. The most successful corporate responses to Robin Hood criticism involve substantive changes to business practices rather than purely symbolic gestures. Companies that genuinely redistribute wealth through higher wages, charitable giving, or community investment programs find it easier to deflect Robin Hood criticism than those that rely only on marketing campaigns. Labor unions have extensively used Robin Hood symbolism in organizing campaigns and collective bargaining negotiations. Union leaders argue that they are modern Robin Hoods fighting corporate sheriffs who exploit workers and hoard profits. This framing helps workers see union membership as heroic resistance rather than mere economic self-interest. It also builds solidarity between workers by casting their struggles in moral rather than purely financial terms. International trade disputes increasingly feature Robin Hood rhetoric as countries accuse each other of unfair economic practices. Developing nations argue that wealthy countries engage in Robin Hood in reverse by extracting resources and profits, while leaving local populations in poverty. Developed countries respond that they are actually modern Robin Hoods, spreading prosperity and development through trade and investment. These competing narratives reflect deeper disagreements about global economic justice. Academic economists have begun studying Robin Hood stories as important factors in economic behavior and policy formation. Behavioral economists investigate how Robin Hood narratives affect individual decision-making about spending, saving, and investing. Political economists analyze how Robin Hood symbolism influences voter preferences and election outcomes. Development economists examine how Robin Hood ideologies affect the success or failure of economic reform programs. The field of narrative economics, pioneered by Nobel laureate Robert Shiller, specifically identifies Robin Hood as one of the most influential economic stories in human history. Shiller argues that Robin Hood narratives have shaped economic thinking for centuries and continue to influence contemporary debates about taxation, regulation, and wealth distribution. Understanding these narrative influences is essential for predicting economic trends and designing effective policies. Central banks have started incorporating Robin Hood analysis into their economic forecasting models, when Robin Hood rhetoric becomes prominent in political discourse. It often predicts increased support for redistributive policies that can affect inflation, currency values, and international trade. Financial markets now track Robin Hood. Social media mentions as leading indicators of potential policy changes and market volatility. The Robin Hood effect has become a recognized phenomenon in economic literature, describing situations where well-intentioned policies designed to help the poor actually benefit the wealthy instead. This can happen when tax loopholes allow rich individuals to avoid Robin Hood taxes, or when social programs create perverse incentives that discourage work and saving. Economists use Robin Hood analysis to design policies that achieve their intended redistributive effects while avoiding unintended consequences. International development organizations have learned that ignoring Robin Hood concerns can doom even well-designed economic programs. Local populations often resist reforms that seem to benefit foreign investors or domestic elites regardless of their technical merits. Successful development programs now incorporate Robin Hood messaging that emphasizes benefits for ordinary citizens and protections against exploitation by powerful interests.
In 2021, a group of computer hackers calling themselves the Sherwood Collective made international headlines by stealing millions of dollars from corrupt government officials and redistributing the money to poverty relief organizations. They left digital calling cards featuring Robin Hood imagery and manifestos explaining their actions in terms of medieval forest justice. Law enforcement agencies worldwide struggled to respond because the hackers had explicitly framed their crimes as moral crusades rather than personal enrichment schemes. The incident marked a new chapter in Robin Hood's evolution from medieval folk hero to digital age, symbol of technological resistance. The Sherwood Collective represented the emergence of cyber Robin Hoods, who use advanced computing skills to challenge corrupt institutions and redistribute digital wealth. These modern outlaws operate in virtual forests of computer networks rather than physical woodlands, but they follow remarkably similar codes of conduct to their medieval predecessors. They target corrupt officials and wealthy individuals who abuse their power while avoiding harm to innocent people. They redistribute stolen resources to worthy causes rather than keeping profits for themselves. They operate outside legal authority but claim moral legitimacy for their actions. The parallels are so precise that they seem deliberately constructed rather than coincidental. Digital Robin Hoods have appeared in contexts ranging from political activism to corporate whistleblowing to international conflict. Anonymous hackers have used Robin Hood symbolism when leaking classified documents that expose government corruption. Cryptocurrency enthusiasts have created Robin Hood protocols that automatically redistribute digital wealth from large holders to smaller ones. Video game players have organized Robin Hood raids that transfer virtual resources from wealthy players to struggling newcomers. These activities demonstrate how Robin Hood stories have adapted to technological environments that medieval audiences could never have imagined. Social media platforms have become modern Sherwood forests where digital Robin Hoods organize resistance movements and challenge institutional authority. Twitter campaigns use Robin Hood hashtags to coordinate economic boycotts against corporations accused of exploitation. Facebook groups share Robin Hood memes that spread awareness about social justice issues. Instagram influencers use Robin Hood imagery to promote charitable causes and political activism. The viral nature of social media amplifies Robin Hood messages far beyond what traditional media could achieve. The democratization of communication technology has enabled ordinary people to become Robin Hood storytellers in ways that were impossible in previous eras. YouTube creators produce Robin Hood-inspired content that reaches millions of viewers without requiring corporate backing or professional credentials. Podcast hosts discuss Robin Hood themes while analyzing contemporary political and social issues. Bloggers write Robin Hood fanfiction that explores modern applications of medieval justice concepts. This grassroots content creation has revitalized Robin Hood stories by connecting them to current events and personal experiences. Educational technology has revolutionized how Robin Hood stories are used for teaching and learning. Virtual reality programs allow students to experience medieval England and make moral decisions as Robin Hood characters. Artificial intelligence tutors use Robin Hood scenarios to teach ethical reasoning and critical thinking skills. Online gaming platforms enable collaborative Robin Hood adventures that build teamwork and leadership abilities. These technological tools make Robin Hood education more engaging and effective than traditional classroom methods. The global reach of internet culture has created unprecedented opportunities for Robin Hood-inspired international cooperation. Climate activists in different countries coordinate Robin Hood-themed protests against fossil fuel companies through encrypted messaging apps. Human rights organizations use Robin Hood symbolism to build solidarity between movements fighting authoritarian governments in various regions. International development groups apply Robin Hood principles when designing crowdfunding campaigns that connect wealthy donors with impoverished communities. These digital connections enable Robin Hood movements to operate at scales that would have been impossible before internet technology. However, the digital age has also created new challenges for Robin Hood movements. Government surveillance systems can track and identify cyber Robin Hoods more effectively than medieval sheriffs could pursue forest outlaws. Corporate security measures protect digital wealth more efficiently than medieval treasuries guarded physical gold. Legal systems have developed sophisticated tools for prosecuting computer crimes that make digital Robin Hood activities extremely risky. The asymmetry between individual hackers and institutional defenders often favors authority rather than rebels. Artificial intelligence presents both opportunities and threats for future Robin Hood movements. Machine learning algorithms could enable more sophisticated cyber Robin Hood attacks that automatically identify corrupt targets and redistribute digital resources. But the same technology could also help authorities predict and prevent Robin Hood activities before they occur. The outcome will likely depend on whether Robin Hood-inspired programmers or authority-defending technologists gain technological advantages in the ongoing digital arms race. The environmental movement has extensively adopted Robin Hood symbolism to frame climate activism as moral crusades against corporate polluters and government inaction. Environmental Robin Hoods use direct action tactics like tree sitting and pipeline blockades that echo medieval forest protection themes. They argue that they are defending the global commons against exploitation by powerful interests who prioritize profit over planetary survival. Climate activists regularly invoke Robin Hood when justifying civil disobedience and other illegal activities aimed at preventing environmental destruction. Social justice movements worldwide have discovered that Robin Hood imagery provides powerful emotional resonance for campaigns against inequality and discrimination. Black Lives Matter organizers use Robin Hood metaphors when describing police brutality as modern sheriff corruption. Immigration rights activists compare themselves to Robin Hood when helping undocumented migrants avoid deportation. LGBTQ advocacy groups invoke Robin Hood when challenging discriminatory laws and policies. These movements find that Robin Hood symbolism helps frame their causes in moral rather than purely political terms. The Me Too movement against sexual harassment and assault has used Robin Hood-inspired rhetoric to describe efforts to hold powerful perpetrators accountable for their actions. Victims and advocates argue that they are modern Robin Hoods fighting corrupt authority figures who have escaped justice through wealth and influence. This framing helps survivors see themselves as heroic resistors rather than passive victims, while building public support for systemic changes to address sexual misconduct.
So what does the future hold for Robin Hood? As we stand at the beginning of the 21st century's third decade, Robin Hood stories continue evolving at an unprecedented pace. New technologies create possibilities for storytelling that medieval minstrels could never have imagined. Virtual reality allows people to experience Robin Hood adventures as immersive participants rather than passive observers. Climate change may produce Robin Hood narratives about protecting the planet from corporate destroyers and government inaction. Artificial intelligence development could create Robin Hood stories about defending human agency against algorithmic control and digital surveillance. Space colonization might generate Robin Hood tales about protecting ordinary settlers from exploitation by powerful corporations and corrupt colonial administrators. Each new challenge will probably produce Robin Hood stories that provide hope and guidance for people facing seemingly impossible odds. The universal appeal of Robin Hood stories suggests they address permanent features of human psychology that transcend specific historical circumstances. As long as there are people who abuse power and people who suffer from that abuse, there will be audiences for stories about heroic individuals who fight back. The specific details will change with each generation, but the core message will remain constant. Courage, generosity, and justice are choices available to everyone regardless of their circumstances. Robin Hood stories remind us that ordinary people have extraordinary potential. When they choose to act with moral clarity and personal courage, international research has revealed that Robin Hood stories appear in some form in virtually every human culture, suggesting that they fulfill fundamental psychological needs that evolution has built into our species. Humans are social animals who depend on cooperation for survival. But we also face constant threats from individuals who exploit group trust for personal advantage. Robin Hood stories provide templates for identifying and resisting these exploiters, while maintaining the social bonds essential for community survival. This evolutionary function explains why Robin Hood stories remain compelling even in modern societies, with democratic institutions and legal protections that medieval people could never have imagined. The psychological need for Robin Hood stories persists because the fundamental tension between individual ambition and community welfare continues to exist in new forms. Modern corruption may be more sophisticated than medieval exploitation, but it still requires moral courage to identify and resist. Robin Hood stories continue to inspire that courage by showing ordinary people that they have the power to make meaningful differences in their communities and the world. The educational value of Robin Hood stories has become increasingly recognized by institutions worldwide. Schools use Robin Hood narratives to teach history, literature, ethics, and critical thinking skills. Mental health professionals incorporate Robin Hood themes into therapy programs for trauma survivors and social justice advocates. Religious organizations draw on Robin Hood examples when teaching about charity, courage, and moral responsibility. International development agencies use Robin Hood imagery to build support for poverty reduction and anti-corruption efforts. These diverse applications demonstrate that Robin Hood stories contain practical wisdom for navigating complex moral challenges in contemporary life. The commercialization of Robin Hood presents both opportunities and threats for the character's future development. Corporate entertainment industries have the resources to create spectacular Robin Hood productions that reach global audiences and introduce new generations to the stories. But commercial pressures often prioritize profit over meaning, leading to Robin Hood content that emphasizes action and spectacle, while neglecting the moral principles that give the character lasting significance. The challenge for future Robin Hood creators will be balancing commercial viability with cultural responsibility to preserve the character's essential values. Independent creators using digital platforms have unprecedented opportunities to tell Robin Hood stories that corporate studios might consider too risky or uncommercial. These grassroots storytellers often produce Robin Hood content that addresses contemporary issues with honesty and creativity that mainstream media avoids. Their work ensures that Robin Hood remains a living folklore that evolves to meet changing social needs rather than museum pieces preserved in historical amber. The global nature of internet culture has created possibilities for Robin Hood stories that transcend national boundaries and cultural divisions. International collaborations produce Robin Hood content that addresses universal human concerns while respecting cultural diversity. These global Robin Hood stories help people recognize that their local struggles against injustice are part of larger worldwide patterns that connect them with others facing similar challenges. The democratization of Robin Hood storytelling through digital technology means that the character's future development will be shaped by millions of individual creators, rather than a small number of professional entertainment companies. This grassroots evolution will probably produce Robin Hood stories that are more diverse, innovative, and responsive to social needs than centralized commercial production could achieve. It will also ensure that Robin Hood remains accessible to people who might be excluded from mainstream entertainment markets. Perhaps the most important lesson from 8 centuries of Robin Hood stories is that legends derive their power not from historical accuracy, but from emotional truth. Robin Hood stories work because they address real human needs for justice, empowerment, and moral clarity that persist across cultures and generations. Whether or not a historical Robin Hood existed becomes less important than understanding why people need to believe in him, and how that belief influences their behavior. The Robin Hood who matters is not the one who may have lived in medieval Yorkshire, but the one who lives in human imagination and inspires people to act with courage and compassion. This Robin Hood is absolutely real, because his influence on human behavior has been enormous and enduring. He has motivated countless acts of generosity, resistance to corruption, and protection of the vulnerable. He has provided moral frameworks for understanding justice that have shaped laws, policies, and social movements. He has given people hope during dark times and courage when facing overwhelming odds. In these ways, Robin Hood is more real than most historical figures, because his impact on human action continues to grow rather than fade with time. The legend that began in medieval English taverns has become humanity's shared heritage, reminding us that justice is not something that happens to us, but something we create through our choices and actions. Whether Robin Hood was real or not, the values he represents are as real as we choose to make them.